Welcome. I'm Louise, Project Delivery Manager. Here at HRA, we've been closely following the cocoa market, and it's been an incredibly volatile time from record-breaking cocoa prices to increasing sustainability pressures. I'm welcomed today by Caroline Mason from our expert network, with over 20 years of experience in the sustainability and food systems, including leadership roles at Co-op and Waitrose. Caroline brings an invaluable insight into the climate and sustainability challenges shaping the cocoa and chocolate markets today. So welcome, Caroline.
Thanks, Louise. I'm really excited to be talking about the cocoa industry. I think it is at a fascinating time, as you say, between the dynamics of what's going on with the climate. People are changing their buying behaviors and perhaps getting a little bit more discerning on where they choose to spend their income. And we've got livelihoods that are impacted by the supply chain of growing cocoa that is consumed around the world. I spend a lot of time working in organizations using my experience for 20 years of working in the sustainability space. But I also spend a lot of time actually unlocking where there are blocks across the supply chain and blocks within teams within an organization that then makes it difficult to make progress in the sustainability space. Now, with the cocoa industry, it is at this crossroads of dynamics, as you say, and we've got West Africa, which is one of the primary producing areas for cocoa. It produces over 60% of the world's cocoa, and it's mainly produced in the Ivory Coast, supported by Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo. And then we've got South America, where there's another big chocolate producing area, and that tends to be single origin chocolate. So Ecuador, for example. And then at the same time, we've got the change that's happening across our climate globally, which is impacting all food systems. Where it's really impacting on the cocoa industry is drier climates, which is then changing the way that the crops are actually behaving and how they're able to adapt to those changes in climate. And it's increasing pressure on disease that can impact on the yields of the crops. And when that then happens, that impacts on the income that comes to those families that those crops are supporting. So the more conscious businesses and supply chains that are part of the cocoa industry are actually really working with all parts of the supply chain and the system, but really the primary producer, the person who's actually growing the cocoa bean and the starting
I
point.
guess in terms of that space, as you say, we are at a crossroads in terms of kind of climate change, regulatory, and also understanding more around kind of the value chain and supply chain. What do you think has been kind of the biggest progress that we've seen over the kind of the last 5-10 years in the cocoa space in terms of sustainability? Do you think some people have been leading the way and others have been falling behind? It'd be great to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of this brand here,
Yeah.
Tony's Coloni, and as a brand, they really set a high benchmark right from the beginning. And they got really clear with what they stand for as a brand from the get-go. So they've built their business model on their purpose and their values. And they've got 5 core pillars really to their business. The first one is being able to trace the bean. So this builds on the piece around regulatory activities that are forcing a shift in the industry. People are wanting to know the journey of the bean from bean to bar. They're wanting to know who has grown this bean, how have they been looked after, and how me buying this chocolate is this going to be helping the communities of West Africa, the families, for example, and also the environment that that bean's being grown in. And I also want to enjoy eating it. I
Definitely.
want it to taste good. So there's the being able to trace where that bean has come from right back to where it was planted in the ground. And that's part of what EUDR is actually driving. It is that transparency so that we can see from every moment of that bean's life right to the bar what has actually happened to that bean. So the regulatory side of things is forcing a shift. So those who already had that as part of their values, so for example, Tony's would be an example of that, they're doing it anyway. And then the rest of the industry is now knows that this legislation is coming and they have to do things about it. So that's the first probably point to that question. The second bit is around prices. We all want to earn a decent wage and we all want to have enough money in our pockets that we can live well as people. And that goes to everyone across the world. So families over in places like West Africa, it's really important that all of those smallholder farmers receive a fair income for the crops that they've grown, that they can then reinvest back into their businesses, and they can actually feed their families and have a life themselves. So, for example, certification is quite helpful with this. So, fair trade would be a really good example of that, because if you buy fair trade chocolate, those farmers are receiving a premium. So, they're receiving more money above the actual price of the cocoa itself. And then, really good businesses like Tony's will pay extra because they actually want to make sure that their farmers, because they realize how important they are, is actually getting a price above the value of the cocoa that the market is saying that it's worth. The third part that I think is really important is farmers feeling supported. We all want to feel safe and like we belong, and this is no different to a farmer that's growing cocoa. So I tend to think of it as these farmers are part of communities and they're growing crops together in a similar area, and then having a business that actually supports them and invests back into them so that they can learn new techniques to improve their agricultural practices so that they can grow better, healthier crops. It means that they get to continually learn. And we all love learning. It creates a sense of connection and community that takes us above and beyond just doing the doing of whatever our activity is day to day. The fourth one, which arguably maybe could be seen as the most important, is actually improving the quality and the productivity of the trees themselves and the nature and the soil and the environment where those trees are grown. Because if we have really healthy trees, it means we're going to have more healthy cocoa and we're going to have more consistent cocoa beans that are being grown. There's a virus that's affecting cocoa plantations at the moment, and it's called the cocoa swollen shoot virus. But fundamentally, the trees get attacked by a virus. And that then means that the cocoa beans are over time are not able to grow, and ultimately the tree dies. There's sort of two playing dynamics that are happening from an agricultural perspective. We've got this virus that's impacting on yield and availability, particularly in West Africa. For cocoa beans to actually grow, they have to be pollinated. So that means they need lots of little insects that move around the crop itself and move the pollen to then pollinate the flowers. And this isn't happening as effectively as what it could be. So things like butterflies and midges and all sorts of small insects that would go around doing that pollinating. Now, when a crop isn't healthy or there isn't enough pollinators, that impacts on how much crop is actually grown. So in areas where you've got climates, you've got dry climates, you've got this virus that's attacking the trees, and you've got not enough pollinators doing what they need to do, it means that yields are affected, which ultimately means that farmer has got less income coming in. So those dynamics can actually affect crop yields by about 20%, which is huge in terms of a farmer's income. So by being able to improve agricultural practices and helping farmers to learn different techniques that they can plant more trees in amongst their plantations that bring in different insects that then improve the biodiversity of that environment where those plants are grown, and learning different practices that means when we do have rain, actually we're capturing that in the soil. So putting mulching and putting leaves over the soil to keep the moisture in it. Little practices like that and learning from each other can really help a farmer to have a much more sustainable crop, as well as looking after the environment at the same time. And the fifth one that's really important is having a long-term contract. So Tony's, for example, they put a 5-year contract in place with their growers. So that means every single one of those growers knows exactly where they stand for the next 5 years. So they're able to reinvest back into their business, know that they are part of something bigger than is just their own cocoa plantation. And the investments that they do make onto their plantations, they're then going to get a return on that. So I'll just recap those 5 things that I think are really important for the cocoa industry. Being able to trace the bean from bean to bar. The second one was farmers actually being paid a higher price for the crops that they're grown. The third one is this network of farmers supporting farmers and feeling like we are stronger together. The fourth one was improving the quality and productivity of the agricultural practices that grow the crops. And then the fourth one is longer term partnerships, so longer term contracts in place to give that security of growing the bean. And that ultimately then means you've got more security across the value chain itself.
Now, they're really interesting. And as you say, it's a very complex value chain in terms of the cocoa from bean to chocolate bar. Do you think in the UK, I guess a lot of those kind of 5 principles impact the cost of the cocoa and chocolate bar at the end of the value chain? Do you think in the UK consumers are willing to pay a bit more for Tony's, for example, with its open supply chain initiative and also fair trade? Or do you think consumers are still looking for the kind of cheaper option on the shelf, for example, from the big brands? I guess it'd be great to understand, do you think the UK consumer will shift to the more better regulatory kind of chocolate bars and higher price, or do you think at the end of the day they're just going to look for their kind of favorite brand and just buy that because it's cheaper?
Probably depends on how addicted you are to sugar.
Yeah, very true.
How much of a chocolate sweet fix that you need at any one point in time.
Yeah.
So it's a great question, and I think it does come down to personal preference and actually how you want to spend your income. So if I just speak for myself as a moment as an example, I love buying single origin chocolate, Venezuelan chocolate, or Ecuador chocolate, and you could say, okay, I'm lucky enough that I'm able to choose to want to do that. But actually, if I'm going to buy chocolate, I want to buy something that's got a really intense flavor. So I tend to go for an 80 to 90%, low sugar, because I'm trying to eat a little less sugar.
Yeah.
And it's got antioxidants in it. The higher the percentage of the cocoa, then you're going to have more antioxidants in it there. So I sort of tease myself and think, well, actually, I'm kind of doing a good thing from a health perspective because higher antioxidants in the chocolate itself. So that's just my choice. And 55.6% of consumers are actually looking for single origin chocolates. And generally, those single origin chocolates, you've got that supply chain transparency piece. So being able to know exactly what's happened with how that bean has been grown, how those communities have been looked after, and how nature has also been invested in. So I guess there's more of a story that's attached to that, and it's going right back to source. Then you have people who are choosing Kit Kat or Cadbury's Dairy Milk, that actually the cocoa percentage is much, much lower and you've got a much higher percentage of sugar. And you may not actually be that interested in how the chocolate's being grown. You just want chocolate.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. It's, as you say, it's a consumer preference. And sometimes you might pick your Cadbury's chocolate bar if you're kind of buying it just because you want to get that sugar hit, or sometimes you might be buying the single origin Ecuadorian chocolate bar because you want to feel like you're doing better for the world and also kind of a higher chocolate content. I think with Tony's Chocolonely and the open supply chain, it's interesting how that's kind of expanding in the market. Seeing Waitrose kind of own label chocolate join that initiative, and I think they partnered with Ben and Jerry's as well. So I think it'd be interesting to see over the next few years how many other kind of partnerships they build, and you'd hope that some of the bigger companies in terms of the chocolate manufacturers also either join forces or kind of really make clear what their kind of cocoa sourcing strategies are as well. Because I think if we look back in the past, sometimes they've gone for 5 years, they don't work, they divert. So I think it's kind of the long-term kind of benefits of them as well. We kind of look at the kind of cocoa industry in terms of the next 5-10 years. Where do you see the kind of biggest challenges in terms of sustainability? I guess we're seeing potentially a shift as you mentioned at the beginning, West Africa kind of produces 60% of the kind of world's cocoa. I think we're seeing more potential manufacturers go look around the world for other kind of places to source. And I think we're seeing more growth in the kind of South Americas, the Ecuador, the
Yeah.
Colombia, Peru,
Yes.
and then also Asia. And I think we have seen kind of Malaysia and Indonesia be cocoa origin countries. And over kind of the last 5-10 years, some of that kind of interest has decreased due to the quality of the cocoa. Do you see, in terms of the next 5-10 years, more people moving away from West Africa? Or do you think more focus is going to go, as you mentioned, in terms of improving kind of the farming practices in West Africa, improving kind of the learnings so they can deal with the climate change better?
The honest answer, Louise, is a combination of all of the above.
Yeah.
And that's driven by a number of forces, some of which you've already touched on. So, consumers becoming more discerning and wanting to understand more about their chocolate and the ethical sourcing of it. Then we've got those countries like West Africa, actually, which are really important. We have to remember whatever the bar of chocolate that's being bought, however much cocoa is in it, that bar of chocolate is supporting a community and it is supporting a family. So countries like West Africa and in those families of the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Togo, there are families that are relying on being able to grow cocoa. And then we have us as consumers who are addicted to sugar.
Yeah.
So the demand probably isn't going to change because I doubt our sweet tooth is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
What is important though is that these families are looked after and that they're reinvested in.
Yeah.
And that reinvesting means things like schools and hospitals so that the children have got schools to go to. They're not forced into labour and they're not forced into working on the farms as child labour. So they can get an education and then they can go on and have a life and choose what it is that they want to do. And they may want to come back and work on the cocoa farm. It is the supply chain's responsibility to make sure that whatever the prices that we're paying for the cocoa, it is going back to those communities.
Mm-hmm.
And that combined with businesses doing that as part of their values and their purpose, combined with regulation that forces the transparency, means that over the next 10 to 15 years, as the climate changes, which will impact on our ability to grow cocoa and have the cocoa plantations, we have to make sure that those people are looked after first and foremostly.
Mm-hmm.
And then what regulation does, it says, well, here's the integrity that says, yes, actually, this supply chain, this business is not only investing back into the communities, but they're giving us the transparency of how that bean has actually been grown and the life cycle of that bean itself.
Yeah. And do you think the new, I guess the EUDR, which was kind of brought in end of last year into Europe, do you think that's definitely we're going to see some change from that coming into play over the next couple of years? Or do you think it's going to take a good few years for actually to see any benefits and change from it?
Well, we're already seeing benefits of the
Mhm.
legislation coming in. So, for example, there's work that's been done in Ghana that's actually trialing geo-spot location. So, using digital technology, and you can see exactly where the tree is, where it's being grown. And what's driving that is deforestation and making sure that where cocoa is grown, we are not clearing any native forest or rainforest.
Mhm.
So the deforestation drive, which is really real, the Amazon is a big source of oxygen and carbon dioxide absorber for us. I think of the Amazon as the lungs of the world, and the tropical forests that are on West Africa, they're equally the lungs of the world. So we need to preserve these very, very, very special ecosystems. So the regulatory piece comes in as a way of making sure that the land that is already planted with trees stays as that, and we don't go clearing any more forest. That cannot change. That
Mhm.
has to only become even more conscious. And that's part of what the legislation is driving, because businesses have to be able to show that we're not taking this crop from an area of land that's being deforested. And that's where things like the geolocation comes in. So you're combining technology and an innovation to meet legislative requirements, and consumers are expecting us to do the right thing. So it's a combination of all of them that's actually driving the shift that needs to happen across the complete value chain.
I think, as you say, it's so very important, and it's good that we're, as you say, already seeing the benefits of that regulation, and hopefully more to come over the next coming years. I guess just in terms of final reflections and predictions over the cocoa industry, where do you, if you had your crystal ball, where do you see kind of the next 5 years in terms of, I guess, what do you think is going to be the priority in the industry, and what do you think could be potentially the biggest challenges, or the one biggest challenge I guess the cocoa growing countries are going to be facing?
So I think probably the biggest challenge for cocoa growers themselves is the ability to grow crops in a healthy way while navigating the change in the climate and how that impacts on the crop's ability to grow and any disease risk that comes to it. And the perfect storm, you could say, that we've got at the moment that's actually driving up prices, that's been driven by changing climate and then disease pressure, which means you've just got less cocoa in the world. Yet we are demanding more cocoa as consumers. So that is kind of a healthy tension, really, in a way, where you've got the demand and the ability to actually grow the crop. Demand is higher and we've got less availability of crops. So that inevitably pushes up price, which then means that we as consumers are ultimately paying more, which then forces us to think, well, actually, can I afford to buy that bar of chocolate? Do I want it? Do I need it? So there's the health side of it that comes into it. And then actually, do I want to know more about how it has been grown so that if I am going to buy chocolate, I'm going to do it with more of an ethical conscious hat on?
Yeah, I think I really agree with those 2 points. And I think more and more in terms of looking at the cocoa market in the UK, dark chocolate, single origin chocolate, knowing where
Yes.
your country, when knowing where the chocolate has come from, is definitely growing when we look at our insight pieces. So I think that's definitely, as you rightly say, are very important factors. And it'll be really interesting, I guess, to see where the next couple of years go. Well, Caroline, it's been really, really great chatting to you. And thank you very much for your time. I know you've been really busy. So yeah, thank you again.
You're very welcome.